Welcome back. It's great to have you with us on Business Review. Tito Mboweni says there will be no strings attached to loans given for development projects by the new BRICS Development Bank. South Africa's former Reserve Bank governor has recently been appointed as a non-executive director of the BRICS Bank. BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China and of course South Africa, are to contribute $100 billion worth of capital to the bank, with South Africa pledging the smallest amount of $5 billion to the fund. The bank is not expected to start the formal business of disbursing funds until sometime next year. Well, the SABC interviewed Mboweni, who has also just been appointed as an Honorary Professor in the School of Economics and Business Sciences at the University of Witwatersrand. Here is his frank conversation with my colleague Nompumelelo Siziba.
The governance structure is you have the heads of states and government of these BRICS countries. And then you have a board of governors, which is the ministers of finance. And then you have the board of directors, which is really responsible for governance and all the related issues. And then the executive, which is led by a president and vice presidents. So basically that's the structure, the architecture of the BRICS Bank. In terms of capital, the bank has an initial capital of $100 billion US, and each country has contributed to the capital base of the bank. Is the bank an alternative to the World Bank, the African Development Bank, or the DBSA, or any other such development finance institutions? The answer is no. It is not in competition. The bank is not a replacement of these other hitherto existing institutions, but it will complement, work with, but try and do things differently to the way in which these banks have been doing their business. That's why we say that the new development bank has the potential to be a game changer in the world of development financing.
Now, you talk about doing things differently. Ultimately, the BRICS Bank is going to be a bank which lends money for projects for development, but ultimately is also going to have to place conditionalities on those monies in terms of...
This is not the World Bank. World Bank places conditionalities. We're more interested in unlocking development. It's not. The World Bank will say, you can't do this, you can't wake up in the morning and go there, you must go this. I'm not going to do such things. So what was previously seen as the best practice by the World Bank and the IMF and so on, we're not going to do that kind of thing.
If I may ask, now initially what's going to happen, there's going to be a $100 billion kitty that is going to be contributed to...
It's not a kitty, it's capital.
Capital, pardon me.
Thank you.
There's going to be $100 billion capital in the bank, which is going to be dispersed in due course. But now, if we just look on the African continent alone, apparently we need something between 90 and $100 billion US per annum to sort out our infrastructure problems right across the continent. And then in Asia, Asia is a vast place. They obviously need lots of attention there, and in Latin America as well. I put it to you that perhaps we're just going to barely scratch the surface, because you've talked about partnering with other institutions, and in so doing, you're going to have to meet halfway in terms of the conditionalities and the way you do things, because your mindsets won't necessarily be the same.
You don't solve centuries-old problems with $100 billion. You can't. And the capital available to the bank is not going to replace other development financing institutions and instruments, investment from the bank, I suspect. In Asia, China has been leading the process of the establishment of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is another $100 billion plus. So China is not in the business of trying to dominate this institution. China is in the business of partnering with the other countries in speeding up the process of development. That's my understanding.
We have a lot of viewers across the continent, and they'll be asking themselves, can African countries call on the new development bank for funds for the various countries around the continent?
my suspicion, by the way, this bank is not even 3 weeks old. So I think we have to be a bit modest in what we think about the bank. We're just busy establishing the office in Shanghai, and people trying to find out where the coffee room is and so on. Trying to understand, sort out, for example, the internet site for the bank and so on. So this is a new institution that was starting de novo. And therefore, a lot of things have to be done. At the next board meeting, which will be in October, we'll go through a series of the policy frameworks which will govern the operations of the institution, including most probably an initial look at the project pipeline that might be there. And that project pipeline, I'm quite certain, will include requests from a number of the African countries, a number of Latin American countries, and Asian countries. You see, the African Development Bank has been working on the continent for many years. They have really assembled a huge pipeline of projects. So we really don't have to go and reinvent the wheel. We know that we need to complete the highway between Cape Town and Cairo that's stuck somewhere in Central Africa. So we know that. And the African Development Bank has already done a lot of work in that regard. So how do we unlock the process and get it going? For many, many years, the political leadership in Southern Africa has been talking about the Inga Dam Hydro Power Project. They've been talking about it for many, many years. Probably that's one of the projects that might come onto the table for consideration. It might be too large, and so on. I'm sure ESCOM will be interested in making an application, and all of this will be considered within the realm of the possibilities.
So it's still yet to be determined what criteria.
This thing is not a month old.
Understood. Okay.
It's a baby.
Understood. Let me ask you one more question. The $100 billion reserve fund that will be there to help rescue countries experiencing problems with their currencies. Now, is that prudent, given the fact that we've seen that in the past, various countries around the world that have tried to intervene in their currencies have just basically put good money after bad and not been able to deal with the fundamentals of the problem? What happens, for example...
No. You're talking about the contingency reserve arrangement, which is an arrangement amongst the central banks of the BRICS countries. Okay. It is a contingency reserve arrangement which has another $100 billion in it. So basically here we're talking about two institutions, the CRA, the contingency reserve arrangement, and then you're talking about the new development bank or the BRICS bank. 100 billion, 100 billion. This BRICS bank, infrastructure financing and development financing, the CRA is there to provide support to countries, particularly in the event of balance of payments difficulties. So it's a kind of a facility which is nearer what used to be called, I think, the CCF from the IMF, the contingency reserve fund or something like that. Okay, yeah. So it's not about currency interventions. I think it's going to be currency interventions. It's a different story, which I don't want to talk about because I have never been convinced that any one country can be in a position to defend a currency. You're defending a currency to what level? And why do you do that?
Well, I'm happy
in South Africa, we went through an experience, the end of which we had a net open foreign currency position of $25 billion. So when I started at the bank, there was a debt of $25 billion, a lot of it occasioned by an attempt to defend the currency. And we ended up being in a poor position. So I, as a former central banker, I'll tell you, forget about that.
That was Tito Mboweni speaking to my colleague